On behalf of the American Society of International Law, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, U.S. Engagement with the United Nations. I'm Lucinda Lowe, the president of the American Society of International Law, and we're here at Tiller House, the headquarters of the Society in Washington, D.C. Today's event is the second of a series the Society is presenting on international law and the Trump administration. The first in our series, The Future of International Agreements, presented on February the 1st, is available on the Society's website, asil.org/100days. The Society is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization founded in 1906. Our mission is to educate about international law and to promote international relations on the basis of law and justice. And this webcast is in furtherance of that mission. It's designed to provide information to people throughout the country who want to have a better understanding of the international law issues we are facing today. Now, statements of the Trump administration since the inauguration on January 20th, as well as comments of now President Trump during the campaign, have raised questions about the strength of the new administration's commitment to the United Nations, an organization the United States was instrumental in founding after World War II. We are fortunate to have as today's speakers people who have deep knowledge of and experience with our engagement with the United Nations from both Republican and Democratic administrations. They will be introduced by our moderator, so I'm not going to go into their backgrounds in detail, but I'd like to thank them and the moderator for joining us today. I'd also like to thank the Society's Executive Director, Mark Agrast, and our staff for their work on this project. And now let me turn the microphone over to our moderator, Susan Karamanian, who is the Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies at the George Washington University School of Law, to introduce our speakers and topic. Susan.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucinda, and good morning. Welcome to the second session on international law and the Trump administration. As Lucinda mentioned, today's session is going to focus on the relationship between the United States and the United Nations. We're very fortunate to have with us today two former senior State Department officials who have worked closely with issues relating to the United Nations. In particular, we have Sheba Crocker, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs under President Barack Obama, and she just completed her tenure at the State Department. And we also have Mark Legon, who was former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs under President George W. Bush. Sheba is now a writer for foreign policy, and Mark is currently the Centennial Fellow and Distinguished Visiting Scholar, Senior Scholar in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Each of them has extensive experience beyond just the specific positions that I identified before, having served in the State Department in numerous capacities. So we're delighted that you could be with us today. And I'm also delighted that we have an audience around the world to participate in this conversation. If I could just take 1 second and put the topic in perspective. And as Lucinda mentioned, the United States was very active in the founding of the United Nations. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt was a major architect of the United Nations. His vision was of a post-war international system, with the United States playing a major role. Under the leadership of President Truman, the United States was active at the San Francisco Conference that it led to the establishment of the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly would vote to establish its permanent headquarters in New York City. And as many of you know, the United States is a substantial funder of the United Nations. Yet we have in the country regular criticism about the United Nations. Many of these criticisms are resonating throughout the United States. Concerns about costs, concerns about inefficiencies, perceived lack of accomplishments, concerns about biases of the organization, and then also just a general sentiment of some people about the lack of U.S. control over the United Nations and a sacrifice of sovereignty. So it's with that background that we're going to start this conversation. And Sheba, if I could ask you to identify just a couple of instances in which the United States has been a leader in the United Nations.
Sure, and thanks so much, Susan. I'm pleased to be here today. There's obviously a lot of ways I think that one could address that question. So I may pick off one that's a bit broader and one that is more specific and a more recent example. In the former category, I would say that the United Nations tends to work at its best as an institution and a set of organizations when the United States plays the role of a force for good and plays a leadership role in the organization in helping to drive the agenda, in helping to drive discussions, in helping to drive specific negotiations. When the United States comes to the table and puts its full diplomatic weight behind seeking to achieve outcomes that are both good for the organization, but also importantly good for the United States and our national interests, then we can have a lot of success and have had a lot of success and been able to really drive good outcomes and drive the organization in directions that are beneficial to the United States, to U.S. citizens, and to people around the world. I think if you want to talk about a more recent example, one that comes to mind is the effort that the United States put into driving an international response to the Ebola crisis. The U.S. and others recognized that this was a crisis that had potentially really devastating implications in terms of the number of people that could have died from that disease. And the United States took the lead in driving a response from the international system and from the UN and its agencies in particular, as well as putting our own military and financial resources, bringing our own military and financial resources to bear in a way that meant that the very worst that was threatened from that crisis was actually not realized. And I think that's a good example, again, of where if we play the right kind of role, the United States really can and has been throughout the history of the United Nations a force for good.
I think that's a perfect example because it reaches health. And also that had an enormous, the potential for enormous effect on security of the country, not just our country, but around the world, and also commerce, the ability of people to cross borders and the like. So thank you. Mark, do you have anything to add in terms of major accomplishments due to U.S. leadership?
I agree with Sheba about when the United States is a catalyst for change. You know, really two parts of the member state bodies. The UN Security Council, where the great powers have great influence, that's really the body that can make international law and change things. And when you think of what you might call the good Iraq War, the war in which the world came together to expel Iraq from trying to annex Kuwait, the United States really used the UN Security Council to bring together legitimacy to deal with that problem. In the bodies that, you know, like the UN General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, where dictatorships and democracies are given equal legitimacy, the United States has regularly used those bodies to call to account those who are, you know, really violating basic values. It's really quite striking that the UN Human Rights Council, for any of its problems, is now passing resolutions on Iran, set up a commission of inquiry to look into atrocities in North Korea. Without the United States, that wouldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm. And so then we've seen the accomplishments that you just gave us in terms of peace and security in particular. What about some of the perceived weaknesses from the perspective of the United States or shortcomings? Mark, do you want to take a stab
Sure.
at that?
I used to work for the infamous Senator Helms from North Carolina and worked on legislation which would, you know, deal with dues that the United States was withholding because of the U.S. doubts about the UN and its efficacy. And the United States has asked the question about whether money is well spent and is efficacious. Reform, I think, is most striking when something goes frightfully wrong. I know that Sheba Crocker and her colleagues worked very hard on the question of sexual exploitation when peacekeepers or in earlier times humanitarian officials of the UN actually kind of leveraged the situation, and instead of relieving harm, extended harm. That's a real problem. When I was the U.S. ambassador to combat human trafficking, I visited the peacekeeping mission in Cote d'Ivoire and talked about how troops from Pakistan had to be sent home because they had committed sexual abuse. That remains a problem, holding people to account when they, instead of relieving human suffering, they extend it. I'd also say that there are biases I alluded to it before. Dictatorships are often treated as being of equal legitimacy to democracies, and Israel is an obsessive focus of the UN. It deserves to be assessed like any other country, but not in a grossly disproportional way the way it is.
And thank you so much for bringing up some of those concerns, whether it be efficiency, concerns about peacekeeping, as well as concerns about bias, because we're going to be focusing on those issues in a little more detail in just a few minutes. Sheba, do you have any response so far to what Mark just said?
So, I mean, I would largely agree with Mark. I think where the United States sometimes plays the role of being a more difficult actor in the UN space does tend to normally reside in around questions related to reform and efficiencies and budget and how much the United States pays into the UN budget. And we sometimes take the view as the United States that we are able to and should be able to come in and, by virtue of our being the largest payer into the system, for example, sort of use this stick of, well, we're going to threaten to cut off our funding if you don't do things the way that we want to do them. I think we sometimes, as the United States, perhaps understandably, and this relates a bit to what I was saying at the beginning about the United States really being a force for good and having an ability to lead in a way that other countries really can't in the UN. I think we also have, it's sometimes difficult for us to accept that ultimately we are one among many other member states at the United Nations. And so we can be sometimes heavy-handed in the way that we approach issues that we care about. That may be necessary because it's hard to bring member states along, and politics at the UN are really, really dicey and sensitive sometimes. But sometimes I think that's to our detriment, because I think, if we take the time to sort of bring other countries along in a more constructive fashion to our point of view on some of these issues, we have tended over the years to have more success in implementing some of the reforms that we care about.
Can I just follow up then, in light of that comment, Mark, with the comment that you made in terms of the funding, is what is the perceived effectiveness of the United States threatening to withhold funds? I mean, you've been through some of this working for the senator, and just in your judgment, given the fact that you've been working in the United States government, but you're very knowledgeable about the United Nations, is that really effective, or are there other tools that we have to be able to accomplish what I consider to be very important objectives?
Well, there is a danger. If you withhold your dues, it is a treaty obligation. And while that may not bother many American citizens, other countries will look at the host country of the UN as being a deadbeat. That aside, how effective is that tactic? The United States used it in the time of Senator Helms and then Senator Biden, leveraging the withheld dues to get reforms, but you can't play that trick over and over again. We managed to get some reforms, but continuing to hold back on U.S. dues, I don't think is a tool that can be effective just as at a tactical level.
Right, great. Well, this leads into, I think, another area in terms of, we talked about the United States as a leader and how important that has been in the United Nations. Could we focus a bit on just some of the accomplishments of the United Nations that perhaps a lot of people may not be aware of? One of the interesting things that there are all these specialized agencies, the Food and Agriculture Organization, International Maritime Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, that allows you to, in effect, be able to fly from one country to the next. And the list goes on. Do you have any sense of the contributions of these organizations and how people may not really understand what they do and the significance of them? Sheba, do you want to take a...
Sure.
Take
Yeah, I used to joke when I started my job as assistant secretary that I learned about a new UN organization every week. And that remained true, I think, basically for the life of my tenure there, because there are 65 of them and counting. And many of them are these so-called specialized and technical agencies, and some are the ones you listed, and there are many others.
Yes.
And I think it is often easy, especially when we get caught up in the United States, in the kind of domestic political fights over the UN and our engagement in the UN, to forget that on a day-to-day basis, there are all of these organizations that are doing work that is really critical, both to things like international commerce and also to things that keep Americans safe, like the World Health Organization, for example, and its work on global health regulations, global health policy, and helping to deal with outbreaks and pandemics and other things that can really impact citizens around the world, including here. The International Civil Aviation Organization, I think, is a perfect example of one that probably doesn't spring to mind when people think about the United Nations, but is in fact a critically important organization that helps secure the safety and security of civil aviation. And that matters to all of us when we get on an airplane. The United Nations even deals with things like our ability to send mail to other countries. And then certainly when you look at the work of some agencies do around the world in the development space and otherwise, in terms of now helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but dealing with things like, we have now reports coming out of the United Nations this week, for example, about looming famine in certain countries around the world. And it's ultimately due to the work, the very often scientific and technical work of the UN specialized agencies, that we have the knowledge base that we need to deal with these problems, and also then the capacity to go into countries and scale up to the extent needed to try to address crises when they occur.
Yeah, I think that it's important, as you indicated, to understand that these institutions are playing a very important role in terms of humanity and taking care of people around the world. But that benefits the peace and security of the world. And I appreciate how you were able to make that link. Mark, do you have any comments at all about these
some things that
specialized
may seem
agencies?
like bleeding heart causes are very much in the U.S. interests. So, the High Commissioner for Refugees, so valuable that in fact, the head of it has become the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. The World Food Program. These deal with situations of acute need. The hungry. This causes issues and causes problems for the United States, and it's good that there's burden sharing, that we have UN agencies that can inoculate children around the world, that can, feed the hungry in a crisis, that can deal with refugees, so the United States doesn't have to do it all on its own and on its dime. Yeah,
that's a very interesting perspective, because it's an understanding of the effect of what occurs abroad here in our country too. Obviously, though, the United Nations has been subject to a lot of criticism, and there have been failures. Can you identify, Mark, some of the major failures? I think it's important that we have an honest assessment of where has the United Nations failed, so that we can then get an appreciation, perhaps, of how to address some of the shortcomings.
Well, I alluded to one before. Sexual exploitation by UN personnel, by peacekeepers, and then impunity. Like if you tell the country that contributes the peacekeepers that there has to be some accountability for the soldier who raped women in the country that they were trying to stabilize, generally the best that you can get is that they get pulled back to their country. But I think the most striking area of failures have been in cases of mass atrocities, whether it was Bosnia, where UN safe havens were overrun or peacekeepers were held hostage, Rwanda, where a genocide wasn't stopped, and candidly, more recently, Syria with atrocities. Now, the failures may not lie at the feet of bureaucrats. The failures may lie at the feet of the great powers that have to make the decisions at the UN Security Council. But we just need to be careful what we mean by the UN. Do we mean the member states? Do we mean Russia and China when they stop something from happening in the UN Security Council? Or do we mean the bureaucrats in the institution? In this case, often it's the great powers that are ones that are failing.
And I think for many people around the world, the example of Syria is front and center in terms of failure, that we have this serious situation where we've had enormous deaths and, of course, the displacement of peoples, yet we have inaction. And we're going to later on talk a bit about the Security Council and the like. But I think it's an example that from which I think we can learn. But you give other examples of Bosnia and Rwanda where perhaps we haven't learned to, going forward with Syria. Sheba, a major failure? Not that we want to smile about a major failure,
Right.
but
I think I just want to foot stomp for a minute the point that Mark was just making, because I think it is really important and we often lose sight of. And in fact, I think it's sometimes deliberate that we lose sight of the need to make a distinction between whether a failure really lies at the feet of the United Nations or to recognize more appropriately that ultimately it's member states that make the decisions about both what the organization does and what it prioritizes. And in the case of the Security Council and issues that come before the Security Council or the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, it's the member states that make up those bodies that are responsible for the decisions that the bodies make. And I think too often we sort of put the fault at the UN itself. Having said that, one thing that I would note is that over its years, now 71, the UN has been incredibly slow to reform in a lot of key areas. And one, and it seems astonishing, but yet is true, is that it continues to have on its books mandates that were agreed to even at the founding of the organization. And because of the interests of potentially particular member states in keeping those bodies going, or in some instances, because of the interests of the bureaucrats themselves who hold jobs that might be lost should those bodies go away, these things just continue. They cost money. They cost money for American taxpayers and all of the member states who pay into the UN system. And this is the kind of thing where sometimes when you realize, you realize that sort of some mandate exists that doesn't even make sense anymore given the current context of the world, you sort of scratch your head and think, why is it that we can't get rid of this? And it is, I think the UN is famous for being for being slow to change in that way. And I would say another is, and to pick up another point that Mark made, is just around the whole question of accountability for failures of the system itself, and in cases like sexual exploitation and abuse, making sure that those who are the alleged perpetrators of whatever the crime is in question are actually held to account. And I think the UN system itself, and here you really can lie the blame somewhat on the system and somewhat on the member states who make decisions around budget, has been really slow to accept the fact that when there are major failures on their watch, somebody in the system should be held accountable for those and should take responsibility, and that does not tend to happen.
And if I could just follow up on that, then, is this really a question perhaps of a lack of leadership, that we don't have within the institution individuals that are prepared to think about the seriousness of certain problems and to make difficult decisions? Is that your perception of it?
I think that's fair, some with respect to perhaps some in the institution, although I would note that we have, in the case of the current Secretary General, who Mark referenced earlier, Antonio Guterres, who just started his term in January, somebody who knows the UN system incredibly well, having served previously for 10 years as the head of as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, but also somebody who was a seasoned and very successful politician in his own country of Portugal, having served as prime minister, among other things, and has a deep commitment to the system, and I think has come in importantly with the mindset that he wants to take on some of these important reforms. And I think it's very much my sense that you need to have it come from both sides, right? You need to have leadership and commitment on the member state side to continue to have the organization evolve in the way it needs to deal with today's problems. But you also have to have the vision and sort of the oomph from the organization side to put forward good ideas to member states and to help bring member states along in the direction that they need to be brought along, and to point out sort of where things really need to shift and change. And I think right now we have the potential for both of those to be there. But in that respect, I would just go back to the point about the United States and its important leadership role, because I think with the United States in a constructive and engaged position, a lot could get done under the tenure of Secretary General Guterres. If the United States does not play that role, I think it becomes much more difficult to achieve that. That's changed.
I was just going to say, the United States should want a strong Secretary General, not someone who is overreaching, but we got Ban Ki-moon as a Secretary General in large part because the U.S. Ambassador John Bolton wanted a clerk. We were better off before that with a strong Secretary General Kofi Annan, who very often came to the same place that the United States wanted on democratic values. But even though he was a lifetime UN figure, was strong. And we should actually want that.
Mm-hmm. Let's, if we could then, building on concerns about the United Nations and management and how effective it is, deal with the issue of the United States funding of the United Nations and proposal to have a substantial, I believe the figure is in terms of 40% funding cut. How would this, if it went into effect, how would it affect the individual programs of the United Nations and, more importantly, the goals of the United States? Mark, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, there's just one kind of in the weeds issue that you need to appreciate. Some parts of the UN are paid for by dues of member states. And then some parts of the UN and agencies depend upon voluntary contributions. And so they have to do a good job or else nations are not going to give money to them. So if you cut money from dues, you need to be careful that you're not perceived as a deadbeat when you're not paying up on your treaty obligation. And you may not have as much influence as you want. On the voluntary side, it is worthwhile to look at the value at each agency. There are a couple agencies that happen to be run by Americans and happen to be very strong, UNICEF and the World Food Program. It would be insanity to cut funding to them because they do good work. I think that at its best, talking about deciding which parts of the UN get more money and less could work the way the British have done it, looking at each agency and how well they're doing and making decisions about whether they should get voluntary funding. That would be the way to do this at its best, as opposed to sort of pulling out the scythe and just cutting funding across the board.
And who specifically would make that assessment from the perspective of the United States?
Well, I think, this is the job of the team back at the State Department. Yeah. You need a blend of political appointees and longtime civil servants to assist the UN ambassador in making that kind of assessment. It would be important not to make oversimplified conclusions. For instance, we don't like UNESCO because the member states decided they were going to vote for the Palestinians to have a seat. Well, that's not really a basis for deciding whether it's something of value to the United States. It's helped educate girls in Afghanistan. That should be the basis of making the decision.
A studied assessment. Take some time, take a lot of energy and resources, I imagine, as well. Shiva, any thoughts in terms of proposed cuts?
So I agree, as usual, with everything that Mark just said, but would pick up maybe on a few points. First, I think it's important to realize that if we cut off our dues, if we stopped paying what we owe as a treaty obligation into the UN system, our so-called assessed contributions, we not only run the risk of being perceived as a deadbeat and losing some influence, therefore, but also under the rules of the different agencies, including the United Nations itself. Once you are a deadbeat for a certain number of years, you actually lose your vote at that organization. This is salient in the case of UNESCO, which Mark just mentioned, where the U.S. has cut off funding because of a statutory restriction that requires us to do so in the event that the Palestinians become a member of an organization. And after 2 years of not paying UNESCO, in fact, the United States lost its vote in the General Assembly there. And this potentially, if you look at especially the UN General Assembly, should it get to that point, could have very serious implications for the United States and our ability to have influence in the UN organization itself and in some of its institutions more broadly. And then I think on the question of voluntary funding, it's also important to remember that I 100% agree with Mark that this should not be done as just sort of an across the board, let's pick an arbitrary number and say we're going to cut that. But also in certain, with respect to certain institutions, and the World Food Program and UNICEF are two of them. If you look at the World Food Program as an example, or even the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the United States pays about 45 to 50% of the World Food Program's budget every year, and we have done that for years and years and years. So if you talk about a 40% cut to an organization like that, you are just kneecapping the organization. And we're talking about the organization, in that case, the World Food Program, whose job it is to feed hungry people around the world. And in the face of famine potentially implicating up to 20 million people, as the UN warned this week in different parts of the world, that would just be devastating to people around the world. And then I think just one other thing that may be a little bit in the weeds, but is important to note, is that the State Department pays part of the UN budget. But because of the broad nature of what all of the organizations do that we were talking about earlier, there are many other parts of the US government that also have an interest in seeing those institutions survive. And so any rigorous and strategic look at whether there are cuts that should be made would actually have to be much broader than just the State Department itself, so that we made sure we make sure that we are not sort of infringing on any equities or infringing on the ability of US agencies to get the work done that they want to get done that may not always be in the mindset of the people at the State Department.
It's interesting in terms of a understanding of the broad reach of the United Nations, well beyond the State Department in particular, and of course the activity of the United Nations that affects so many people. You mentioned Palestine. We heard earlier just a brief reference to concerns about anti-Israel bias. The Ambassador Haley over the weekend said, "I am here to emphasize that the United States is determined to stand up to the United Nations anti-Israel bias," end quote. Is this, in your judgment, Mark, a fair critique? And if it is, then what remedy can best address the concern?
Put your finger right on it. It is a fair assessment. There is a bias. You look at the UN Human Rights Council, the Security Council, there is so much more attention paid to one nation and its conduct than any other. But then the question is, what do you do about it? And the United States needs to look how not to shoot itself in the foot. I'll give you an example. The Bush administration that I served in decided not to be a member of the UN Human Rights Council, in part because of that bias against Israel. By not running for the council, it had less of a voice there. A smart decision was made to get onto the council and run, and in 6 years, when the United States was on the Human Rights Council, the number of special sessions and unfair resolutions on Israel went markedly down. The one thing you should do is stay in the arena. Don't pull out of UNESCO. Don't step away from the Human Rights Council. Go be a forceful voice in the arena.
Yes, that's very interesting because of you identify the cost of the absence.
I remember that my former boss, Reagan's UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, said, "We're here to engage and take the institution seriously. The bad news is we're going to be a loud voice within the institution." That is, in fact, a wise
Can I follow up with that then? And a question for both of you, and of course, Sheba, chime in at any time. Is the approach of having the ambassador make the public statements of the concern about the anti-Israel bias, and very, in my judgment, very forceful, but also it resonated with me. I can read what happens. Is this the best approach, or do you think that there are other ways to have the problem addressed? Are there other ways rather than just coming out of a meeting and then publicly announcing the concern?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to note that that although Ambassador Haley's statement over the weekend was quite forceful, as you noted, it is not in any way a new statement that anyone would have heard from the United States. It has long been U.S. policy spanning both Republican and Democratic administrations to try to do everything that the U.S. can to fight back against the anti-Israel bias that exists in parts of the system, and to be quite forceful in public statements about that, and to use the voice and vote of the United States, including the veto in the Security Council from time to time, and to act as to try to act to defend Israel, in whether it's to tamp down the number of resolutions at a Human Rights Council that focus on Israel, or whether it's to sometimes cast the sole no vote against resolutions, thereby in certain cases blocking consensus on them, and many of I think at one point we tallied up the number of actions in a 2-year span that the Obama administration had taken throughout the UN system and all of its organizations in defense of Israel, and it was somewhere over 200 actions when all told. So it's not a new position. Although I think it is also at the same time important to note that I expect that the position will be much more strongly held. And I think, unfortunately, and this gets back to Mark's point, that it will mean that the United States views too much of what is done by the UN system and evaluates our own engagement in that system through the prism of Israel. And I think that will be to the detriment of making sure that we could actually use the system to advance a whole host of U.S. national security and other interests, as we've discussed.
So as a follow-up to that, then, Mark gave us a sense of a proposed remedy in terms of just staying engaged. Do you have any specific remedy for the anti-Israel bias other than you indicated we've shown how the U.S. has been engaged with Israel in the United Nations, but are there other specific recommendations that you have?
Well, I agree with Mark that I think we should, I think things like a funding cutoff to an entire organization because of a decision that might have been made by its member states to accept Palestine as a member is not the way the United States should really go about evaluating any of our decisions about engagement in the UN system. But I think it's also important to note that alongside the defense of Israel, Israel itself has an interest, and the United States has really supported Israel's efforts in this regard in the so-called positive agenda that Israel has in the UN system, which relates to its ability to be a member of certain consultative bodies, to Israeli citizens being hired as employees throughout the UN system, through Israel contributing to humanitarian efforts, to peacekeeping efforts, and otherwise. And I think over time, the more that Israel can sort of normalize its role in the UN system, that is probably going to be the thing that would help the most to tamp down some of this bias. It is a long-held view of member states, and one that will be a very difficult nut to crack. But I do think the United States could be also more thoughtful and not necessarily as knee-jerk about how we sometimes respond when these issues come up in the UN system.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like an essay, a follow-on essay in terms of Israel's engagement with the United Nations and getting information out about that. Mark, you mentioned the Human Rights Council and questions about the legitimacy of the Human Rights Council. For our viewers, you may just want to give a little background as to how the council came about. And I looked at the list of members this morning before coming over, and I saw that Saudi Arabia is a member, and Cuba and China. And I think the perception of concerns of some of these countries that are perceived not to have a strong internal record of human rights, having a substantial voice in the area of human rights. And so just want to get your thoughts about that.
Well, there was a negotiation about a dozen years ago to replace the Commission on Human Rights with a better body that wouldn't have some of the politicization. Of course, it's hard to levy the charge against a UN body that it's politicized because it's a political body. But the Human Rights Council is not very different from what came before. The body before had 53 members. The current one has 47, but it does have some improvements. Basically, there has to be an open election in the General Assembly where a majority of states have to vote for a country. They don't just slide in on a slate from their own region. They make promises about their conduct. They sometimes violate them, but they need to get on the record, promises about their human rights record. And there's a peer review mechanism so that every country, even if it's a hard dictatorship getting elected, has a regular time that's approved. So it is a problem that there are dictatorships and appalling dictatorships on the body. It does hurt the legitimacy, but they can lose elections. Russia, after its horrendous humanitarian abuses in bombing in Aleppo, lost an election for the first time, even though it's a permanent member of the Security Council, lost an election to get on the main human rights body. So I just say we had to recruit better members, encourage not so rich democracies that share our values around the world to spend the time to try and get on the body. We need to avoid biases. We shouldn't back so-called allies like Saudi Arabia to get on the body. The UK is pretty crummy that it traded votes to get Saudi Arabia to vote for them, and they agreed to vote for Saudi Arabia. And the Human Rights Council can bounce members from its membership. It managed to bounce Libya from its membership when Muammar Gaddafi threatened his own people. It ought to do it again and prove that it has standards.
Shiva, any reaction to
Mark is
Mark's
just
proposals?
exposing all kinds of dirty secrets of how UN elections work.
Yeah.
What you didn't mention is that in addition to making promises about their human rights record, when countries are running for elections in the UN system, they all often give gifts, and fairly serious gifts. So we hear about sort of the Egyptian delegation providing iPads for everyone who will vote for them in the UN Human Rights Council elections and other things like that. The United States usually, has like a color pamphlet that we maybe have put together. So we're not at quite
And just
the
so
same
we're clear,
place.
what is the United States position on the voting itself? We're very,
So-
I think, very consistent.
Yes, we are very consistent, as you note, and we rise. If we are nothing if we don't rise and fall on our principle as the United States, and so we do not engage in this so-called vote trading that most other countries in the UN system do engage in, and so we also sort of don't bribe countries to vote for us. We try to run on the basis of our own record, and I think one thing that's also important to note that may not always be recognized from the outside is that a lot of times in these elections there are so-called clean slates. So regions run candidates, and so what that often means, because they don't want to get down and dirty in terms of really competitive elections, is that there will be agreements sometimes years in advance. I would have countries coming in to talk to me about Security Council elections that were literally 10 years in advance, because they have regional rotation of seats, and they agree in advance they're going to be two from whatever, if they have two slots, that it's going to be these two countries that are running for such and such term. Same happens in the Human Rights Council case. And so sometimes the most that you can do is not vote for a country, but when you're one of 193 member states casting a vote, that might not have that much impact at the end of the day if there is a so-called clean slate election. I think Mark's exactly right, that we have to continue to work at trying to persuade countries with better human rights records to run for the Human Rights Council. It is embarrassing that some of these really bad dictatorships and human rights violators are on the council, but I think the fact that they are there also reinforces the point that Mark was making earlier about how important it is for the United States to be at the table. These countries are there because they think it's important what this body says, and they want to try to dictate and own that conversation. When the United States is in the game, we can help drive the conversation. When we're not, these actors that have aims that are sometimes really diametrically opposed to things that the United States cares deeply about have the louder voice in the room, and that seems to mean something that we shouldn't want under any U.S. administration.
What do you say to those who look at the activity of the council, and it is an assessment of human rights in various countries, including our own country, looking at, for example, implementation of the death penalty or conditions of prisons, and the sense of we should not be subject to this outside scrutiny, particularly by an institution that has as its members individuals from states that at least we believe do not have an outstanding human rights record, at least compared to ours. Do you want to take a stab at that, Shiva? Or?
Well, it's very much my sense that one of the things that has made the United States the great country that it is the fact that we are willing to take the heat, and we are willing to open up our own record. We are very transparent, both about the things that we are great at and about the times that we fail and the flaws that we have as a country. And I think that it makes our voice much stronger in the UN system when we are willing to and in the international community more broadly, when we are willing to open ourselves up. Sometimes that means criticism, but we're very transparent about it. And when we go through the peer review process that Mark was referencing at the UN Human Rights Council, which is the Universal Periodic Review, it is a broad-based process in this country that involves many, many meetings with civil society. We had over 100 recommendations the last time we went through the process, and we then very diligently go about the business of trying to implement the recommendations that are put forward to the United States. And so I hope that we will continue to participate in the UN Human Rights Council and the other bodies of the UN system in that vein, right? Because it's hard for us to have too much of a double standard. We can't expect other countries to expose their own records, and we can't encourage them to be more transparent when we think they should be if we're not willing to act in the same way.
Great. Mark,
I don't think
thoughts?
the United States should be too thin-skinned. If it really would like to have the UN look at some of the most heinous problems around the world, it has to be willing, to undergo some scrutiny. If, for instance, the United States played a key role in the creation of a monitor, a special rapporteur for freedom of assembly and freedom of association. Around the world, dictatorships and ostensible democracies are squeezing the opportunity for civil society to have a voice. Well, a Kenyan who's a really great lawyer, Maina Kiai, is the rapporteur. Well, he came to the United States. He went to look at the situation of workers down in Louisiana and that Gulf. He went to the political conventions of the United States. He offered some critiques, and he praised a lot of things about the way things work for freedom of assembly here in the United States. We should want this, because then he can get access to other countries, and the United States doesn't look like a hypocrite.
Yeah. Yes, that's very interesting in terms of how the United Nations, through identifying issues here in the United States from an outsider, can in turn shape conduct around the world.
And then if you
Yes.
want to call attention to problems of something like freedom of assembly in a China or in a Rwanda, it's better that it comes from a Kenyan who's with the UN than necessarily a US official.
Yes.
It adds to the voices about problems in other places in the world.
Right. Well, if I could change the subject a little bit, but Sheba mentioned the peacekeeping operations and some of the concerns that have been raised just in terms of individual peacekeepers and relationships with their own countries and the like. Mark, what is your sense in terms of the effectiveness of peacekeeping? It's a very important aspect of the United Nations. How effective is it?
This is really important to the United States. You know, right now in the country, we're thinking about how often we're going to send our troops abroad to bear the burdens for the world of stability and peace. UN peacekeeping really spreads the burden. It means that US troops don't have to be the ones that are going and occupying countries that are in conflict or just after conflicts. The key thing that peacekeeping operations and the US played a role in this have improved on is distinguishing types of situations. Sometimes you've got like a settled peace agreement in a place and you just send in the peacekeepers interposed between the former warring parties, but it's stable and they just keep it that way. But you need to recognize those situations where the peacekeepers need to be really peace enforcers. And if there are aggressors, particularly continuing to engage in atrocities, that they act. If you look at a complicated and long-standing mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you have previous atrocities, problematic countries around the Democratic Republic of Congo involved in its internal affairs, and then elections occurring recently with a threat of violence. That's a place where you really need the troops, the police, the civilians involved in that peacekeeping mission.
Sheba, some thoughts on the topic of peacekeepers?
It is a very broad topic.
Yeah.
So in general, agree very much with Mark about the point of the global burden sharing that UN peacekeeping provides. And it's a critical one to the United States because it's not only that it involves other countries and importantly with boots on the ground and also with helping with the funding, but it means that in cases that could potentially have a very direct impact on the national security of the United States, it's not always US troops that have to go around and police these situations in the world. Now, I mean, ultimately, of course, the question about the effectiveness of peacekeeping has to take a look at each individual mission, and that's beyond the scope of this conversation today. But it's certainly the case that we need to continue as the United States and as other members of the Security Council, which oversees peacekeeping missions, to always take a very hard look at when a particular peacekeeping mission may have run its course, when it's better for the mandate of the mission and the makeup of the mission to change, or whether it can be drawn down or ended altogether. And things don't often end in the UN system, as I alluded to earlier, but that's an important conversation that needs to take place. The United States also, under the Obama administration, put a lot of muscle behind the question of peacekeeping reform. And there is much work that has been done, but a lot more that needs to be done.
Can you identify
space.
just like one of the reform measures?
So, I mean, there are many, but to pick up a point that Mark was making, peacekeepers now are being asked to operate in far more challenging and complex environments where the kinds of troops and the specialties that are needed, and in some cases the equipment and the technology that is needed, often far outpace what is available and what has been available traditionally to the UN in the form of just sort of general infantry troops coming from a certain set of countries that have historically been the biggest troop contributing countries. The UN has not traditionally been all that great at strategic planning and preparation for missions and being able to match particular capabilities to the mandates that are agreed by the Security Council. These are all the kinds of questions that the United States and others were trying to take on, in addition to encouraging a broader base of troop contributing countries to be available for peacekeeping missions. Because if you have to go back to the same well time and again, and those countries have been incredibly generous with respect to contributing troops to peacekeeping missions, you are only going to have, you know, a certain kind of tool to deal with the problem. And if you look at, you know, a mission like like the mission in Mali as an example, incredibly complex operating environment, the most dangerous peacekeeping mission that exists right now of all 16 of them that the UN runs. Many more peacekeepers have died serving in that mission than any other in recent years. And the makeup and mix of what they need from an intelligence standpoint, from the ability to evacuate troops that are injured or killed in action, to mine-resistant vehicles, to IED training, counter-IED training, all of that kind of thing. You're just not going to find that with sort of your run-of-the-mill general infantry troops coming out of the big traditional troop contributing countries. So the UN needs to evolve in these ways, and it frankly needs the help of the United States and others to help continue to prod it.
Yeah, particularly with our military capacity and leadership in terms of understanding, like, for example, mines and the like. Yeah. Let's, if we could, for the final topic, move into an issue that both of you touched on very briefly earlier, and that is the criticism of the United States, or excuse me, the United Nations, as to the Security Council, that it is purely a political body and it's unable to act in instances of serious threats to peace and security. And the perfect example we have now is Syria. What's your response to that, Mark?
Well, look, there have been times where the Security Council has played great value. And, you know, for instance, it's really helped put the squeeze on Iran as a nuclear proliferator with sanctions. And the United States used the Security Council there. In Syria, it has not done what it should. Gross atrocities have been committed by the government of Assad against his own people. And ISIS has been left to grow and become another source of atrocities. That lies mostly at the feet of Russia and China that have a veto in the Security Council. But I will say, and since we've agreed on a lot, maybe we should have a little bit of daylight between us. I do think that the United States at times, whether it was when Rwanda was happening at the Security Council and with Syria, that it's not just a matter of who has the foot on the brake, like Russia and China, but whether the United States asserts leadership to do more with the foot on the gas pedal.
So what should have been done in your judgment?
I really think that the kind of effort that was made to line up people on the Iran sanctions needed to be done in the Security Council and elsewhere. I mean, we think, you know, that the UN Human Rights Council has its failings, but the UN Human Rights Council's managed to act over and over again and document atrocities in Syria. That ought to transition into the Security Council. The United States can't just give Russia and China political will by, you know, giving them a shot in the arm, but it really needs to turn up the heat. I'm going to say this point.
And you think that could have happened? You think there were?
I think there was more
tools that we had in order to bring Russia and China to the table in Syria?
Well, if we really think that the international community has a responsibility to step in when a government is allowing atrocities to occur, then maybe we shouldn't let the Security Council be a break. I'll give you an example. We wanted to prevent ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, and the Security Council blocked an authorization under the Clinton administration for taking action. NATO went ahead and did it anyway. And I think at a certain point, if there's something so serious, we shouldn't allow the Security Council to be so sacrosanct. We should threaten that kind of action, as an international community, and really shame the Russias and the Chinas into, are they gonna assert vetoes? Are they gonna stand with their feet across the track?
Or Russia may use force of its own.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Sheba?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say I can't disagree with much of what Mark said there.
Good.
I think it's important to also remember ultimately that when the United Nations was founded 71 years ago, it was founded for a purpose, which was to prevent another war between the great powers. And in that purpose, the United Nations and the Security Council have succeeded thus far. And it's important not to lose sight of that. It doesn't discount the fact that in these very in these horrible cases that Mark has cited throughout the course of this conversation, the Security Council has from time to time found itself unable to agree as a political matter to do the right thing. And that has often meant that one or the other or several of the great powers have decided to exercise the use of their veto in ways that have stymied the ability of the Council to act. I think it might be worth going back to something that happened in early October, which is perhaps illustrative of the fact that it's a bit of a broader problem, although I would not take issue with Mark's suggestion that the United States continues to need to do more to try to drive the resolution of the Syria conflict in a more positive direction. But that was that there is a mechanism in the UN system where if the Security Council, which is the prime organ that is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security under the UN Charter, if the Security Council is unable to act for whatever reason, the General Assembly can take up an issue, which is the full membership of the United Nations. And the General Assembly, in fact, did have an extraordinary meeting on Syria in the beginning of October. And rather extraordinarily at that meeting, which was ostensibly about the situation in Aleppo, where Russia had been carrying out its horrible bombing campaign, there was maybe a handful of countries that even mentioned the word Russia in the entire course of the discussion before the General Assembly. And I think that points to a broader problem that we have, which is not dissimilar from some of the challenges that we're facing in political discourse in this country right now, which is that too often countries are now finding themselves willing to believe that there may be two sides of a story. We can see what the facts are of what happened in Aleppo, but if Russia comes into the Security Council and lies about what it's doing or lies about the situation on the ground, or the Syrian permanent representative does, too often we found ourselves in recent months and over the course of the past few years in a situation in which there was a little bit of like, maybe and maybe not, and it's hard to say, and the situation is unclear, and not really wanting to point fingers. Now, I think ultimately in the secret ballot elections that were held a few weeks after this General Assembly meeting for the Human Rights Council, countries took out their peak against Russia by voting it off the Human Rights Council, which was rather unprecedented. And it was easier to do because it was a secret ballot election and it wasn't in front of all other member states. But we have challenges there. We have challenges as an international community in making sure that facts still win the day, and in making sure that we can, from a diplomatic perspective, bring the requisite number of countries along. It's also important to remember that the way Security Council resolutions work, you not only need to have no vetoes from a permanent 5-member, you also need to have 9 affirmative votes. And so that's a diplomatic challenge that we engage in all the time when trying to push forward Security Council resolutions.
Your observation also prompted me to think about a topic we're not going to have time to cover today, but that in terms of gathering information, the engagement of the United Nations with civil society in various countries and organizations that are on the ground and finding out information about the treatment of people, in Syria. I think this is going to be very important in terms of what would happen in a few more years once some sense of accountability can occur. I know we're getting close to the end, but I would like to just ask one more question, and that is that we've had the opportunity to look at specific problems with the United Nations and proposed reforms and the like. Could you just identify one reform that we haven't talked about so far that you would like to see implemented? Sheba, I'll start with you.
Okay. So if I had a chance to do two, I would have had accountability as
Okay.
one. And I did touch on that before.
Yeah.
But to touch on something we haven't really, and it actually picks up on Mark's focus, right focus on atrocity prevention, is the whole question of sort of the peace, the conflict prevention to peacekeeping to peace building continuum. And this is an area that is getting a little bit more focus in terms of the need to really reform, in particular, how the UN does its work around conflict prevention, around mediation, and around peace building. We know a lot about how the UN does peacekeeping and what reforms need to take place, but really we do need to think of this as being a continuum from the political to the hardcore security, and then at the back end on the peace building. I think Antonio Guterres has the right frame of mind to address this, and I hope that we and other countries in the UN system will give him the support he needs to make some real progress.
Right.
there.
I think that's a wonderful observation, that we cannot be reactive. We have to be thinking in terms of at the early stages of prevention. Mark.
Well, my runner-up would be civil society. You mentioned civil society. The UN Charter begins "We the Peoples," and we need to remember that it is not only a member state organization, but it's supposed to help the dignity of individual human beings. It needs to engage civil society organizations for information, shaping the sustainable development goals. It has an accreditation committee where dictatorships block civil society organizations from being involved. That's awful. But my reform would be that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council with a veto should not use that veto to block action on a case of atrocities. We may not be able to get the composition of the UN Security Council to change because it'll get caught up in a deadlock, but that is something, if we could get to that point, that would really help.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Mark Legon and Sheba Crocker for their outstanding contributions to this conversation today about the United States engagement with the United Nations. I think there are a lot of challenges that have been put to the table, and I hope for those who've been able to participate around the world that you understand the United States perspective better, and also you learned a lot about the United Nations, and you can see the challenges that that we are going to be facing going forward. Lucinda, I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Thank you, Susan, very much. Let me second your thanks to our speakers for sharing their very thoughtful observations about this important topic, and to Susan for navigating us through the discussion. For those of you who want to share this with colleagues or friends, it will be posted on the web in the next couple of hours on the ASIL website at 100 days. So please look for that. We welcome your feedback on this webcast, what we've done well, what we could be doing better, other topics that we could be tackling. And I'd also, particularly given the discussion of the UN specialized agencies, point you to our publication, International Law, 100 Ways It Affects Our Lives, because there are numerous examples in there, some of which were cited today, about the contributions that the work of the UN has made to our daily lives. Our next webcast in this series will be on the 15th of March at this same time, and our topic will be U.S. participation in global trade agreements. I hope you will join us for that interesting discussion, and thank you again for joining us today.